everyone, Professor Wills here. Welcome back. We're continuing our unit on the Gothic world, and what we're going to focus on in this video mini lecture is Gothic sculpture. We've talked about a little bit of sculpture so far in this unit, but most of our attention on sculpture has been in the Romanesque world, which was prior to the Gothic world. Let's see what changes are afoot as we move forward in time. One thing I can give you a hint about is we're going to see the pendulum swing back towards the naturalism and away from more of that otherworldly kind of distortion of holy figures, which of course was interpreted, by the faithful as appropriate for higher level otherworldly beings. But we're going to see the influence of the Greco-Roman world, all of that believable naturalism in terms of the description of the human body, even start to reappear in the description of holy figures. And that in turn will help the faithful connect, find a relatable divinity in which to pray to, that kind of thing. Another characteristic of the Gothic world is the love of the Virgin Mary. Plenty of art about Jesus, but we're going to start to see her as a focal point for not only the program of stained glass we looked at Chartres Cathedral, but we'll begin with Chartres Cathedral, moving outside to see her showcased on one of the exterior tympanums, and then once again focused at another famous French cathedral, Reims Cathedral, where we'll see her part of a program of exterior sculptures there. So a little bit of a more of a softer maternal vibe going on with the Virgin Mary, less of the threat of a judgment day, as was so common in the depiction of Christ in the medieval world. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to that PowerPoint, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm just going to take myself away for a few minutes here so you can see the image and the caption information. I'll pop back in shortly. But much like the Romanesque period, exterior displays of sculptural reliefs in the form of tympanums were extremely common. Again, they're almost like exterior billboards with scenes for, a population that was largely illiterate to motivate them to go to church, right? So the themes on this trio here, which are fairly elaborate, usually we're just used to seeing maybe one tympanum, we have now three. It relates to scenes of Christ's ascension. Here, the second coming of Christ is the subject of the center one. Again, that's referencing Judgment Day, where Christ reappears and renders judgment on all of our souls, whether you're going to get into heaven or end up in the fiery pits of hell. He's depicted here in the middle, surrounded by symbols of the four evangelists, very common motif we've seen in medieval art history for a long while now. But over here, this is a depiction of the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus in her lap. And again, that's part of her growing, fandom for the Mother of Christ, that you start to see her prominently displayed more than ever before as well. Now, I know you think I'm going to deep dive into these tympanums. I'm not. I'm interested in sharing with you in this mid-12th century example of sculpture these elements down here. So you might see that there is sculpture going on flanking each doorway. And these are called Jamb statues. And so let's take a look at this form of sculpture that you see in the Gothic world. Jamb statues. There's the word up there on your left-hand side. So again, we're looking at the middle of the 12th century. So what's amazing about this is this whole program, whether the tympanum sculptural reliefs or the Jamb statues, survived a terrible fire that destroyed much of the church, but this west side of it was preserved, fortunately, for our appreciation from an art historical perspective here. What you find with these figures here is sculptures, instead of just columns or decorative, patterned piers, that kind of thing. framing a doorway. We find that they create essentially like colonnettes or slender small columns, but suspended on them are, full figure, very high or raised relief sculptural depictions of the kings and queens of the Old Testament. So both male and female kings and queens, they're considered the ancestors of Christ. And so when you think about the whole program of sculpture, the kings and queens of the Old Testament represent the early days, right? So up above all of this program featuring Jesus and Mary and the evangelists, etc., represent the New Testament. So it's kind of like they provide the foundation, if you will, to what would come eventually as, mankind's, Jesus as the embodiment of, our Savior, for mankind's sins and redemptions, that kind of thing. That's how it is meant to be understood. Okay, looking at them a little bit more closely here, and I'll come back to you. You might notice that they are, typical of this era, disproportionate. They're a little bit too elongated, and their robes are, very stylized, meaning unlike what we studied in the Greco-Roman world, where figures were clothed, but they described the anatomy underneath very accurately. Here, they look like long, tubular forms with, stylized linear designs, whether this sort of cascading arc and wave-like scallops of their robes, very reminiscent of the slightly older Romanesque Old Testament prophet featured on the Church of St. Pierre as a supportive, kind of fully in the round sculptural post in the doorway of that particular space. Again, where he was, this X-shaped presentation of his legs, extremely stylized and elongated. The priority on, again, sort of this otherworldly look of a kind of a higher order holy being was more expected and accepted in those days. And so that, that kind of disproportionality, why it occurred, right? They didn't say, hey, that doesn't look like you and I. It's a way to delineate or demarcate people who were considered more extraordinary and special, like Old Testament kings and queens. But what you do find, if you look at their faces, is unlike this sort of prophet here, who's literally tripping out on a prophecy, a vision that he's having. So he looks a little bit high as a kite. On the left, the Old Testament kings and queens here on Chartres Cathedral's west portal entrance, their faces have a softer expression, a more human expression, more naturalistic and relatable. This is sort of the baby steps I'm talking about towards a return to naturalism in carving something that is more relatable, less mask-like or stoic or tripped out and otherworldly. Okay, let's move on then. Okay, so we're leaving Chartres Cathedral, and we're moving to our second example of Reims Cathedral. Now, we're not digging into the architecture of this place, but by now you should be pretty fluent in recognizing a Gothic church. You can see plenty of those pointed arches, rose windows, the dissolving of the walls, very much, and of course soaring verticality is very much a way of recognizing a Gothic cathedral. So at the portal, let me flash back for a minute. Just like we saw at Chartres Cathedral, you have stained glass replacing the tympanum. So all the sculpture are Jamb sculptures flanking the doorways, just like we saw previously. So moving on here, we're now in the middle of the 13th century of the Gothic world, and this is a program, the best program of all of the Jamb statues at Reims Cathedral, featuring two kind of mini episodes in the life of the Virgin Mary. The left pair, right here, reflect a theme called the Annunciation, and I'll come back to what that event is about. And then the right pair of statues reflects another theme in the life of Mary called the Visitation. So again, they're Jamb statues, sculpted and installed, almost like the Greek sculptures of Chori women that you found on their early temples. They are nearly freestanding, but you still see them bound to these kind of architectural platforms and again attached to the columns behind them. So they are Jamb statues. There's not statues you can remove and reposition in a different location. They are attached to the cathedral entrance themselves, but a lot more free than what we saw earlier, of course, at Chartres. Over here, they seem to be much more bound to the portal itself. Okay, what else is going on here? Well, let's begin on the right-hand side here. Now, this is an episode of Mary's life called The Visitation. This is when she visits Elizabeth. Mary is pregnant with baby Jesus, and she visits Elizabeth, who's pregnant with John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin. So it's depicting Mary and Elizabeth. But remember our studies on Roman classical world sculpture. You have, they think, 3 different sculptors working on these 4 statues. So looks like the ones on the right are by the same sculptor, and they look very much referencing that sort of classical world flavor. You have proportional figures, their heads aren't too small, their bodies aren't too long, and though they are wrapped in the thickest biblical robes, you can see that contrapposto stance. So even though covered up, you can read the anatomy of the human body beneath the fabric. They seem to be interacting with each other, heads turned to each other's direction, gesturing to each other. They seem to have a kind of a human relationship with one another. Meanwhile, on the left, not so much. This figure of Mary and this angel, who's supposed to be the angel Gabriel. So the Annunciation is the moment when the angel descends and appears before Mary and tells her that she's going to become a mother, that she will bear Jesus, who will be the Savior to the world, etc., etc., etc. So, surprise, news to her, but that's supposed to be what these two are communicating to the viewer. Look how different they look. This is obviously a completely different sculpture. You have a highly more stylized medieval interpretation of Gabriel with a figure that's a little bit elongated, the head's too small. This angel has sort of this weird, impish, mischievous look on his face, whereas Mary, compared to maybe the women over here, is more minimalistic, more kind of frozen. You can't really read her anatomy very well underneath her robes. Her face is expressionless and wooden. So you can see that within, the same period of time, you get something that on the far left represents sort of this stylized look of the French Gothic period up to this point, but moving slowly to the right, you can see that pendulum swinging towards Greco-Roman naturalism. That will be the characteristic of the upcoming Renaissance period. So, that's the way art history rolls. It goes back and forth between abstraction and naturalism, and of course, in the modern era, we have something that's a whole mixed bag of whatever you want, experience in the world of art. That's it for now. Thanks for joining me on this examination of Gothic sculpture and the beginnings of a trend towards naturalism, even for the holiest of figures. Thanks.